So we can actually do two simple substitutions to this model in order to improve it. And that doesn't change the model or the interpretation of any of the interpretation that we just talked about. All it does is help indicate to us if the managers are trying to, say, increase free cash flows by lowering the investment rate. Right? And so if that is the case, we can substitute the definition of free cash flow, which is NOPLAT, or the operating profit minus the investment rate. And here we just done a simple substitution so that we set free cash flow equal to operating profit. NOPLAT stands for net operating profit less adjusted taxes. And if we multiply that in, we see that it's NOPLAT minus the investment rate on NOPLAT. So operating profit minus the investment rate. Now, if a manager tries to increase value by decreasing the investment rate, we would observe that here. We would observe that it does increase value temporarily, but because we could see the investment rate, we would know that the company was actually taking was doing a bad ploy in order to try to fool the investor. And if we wanted to see if growth was being juiced by, say, taking on negative projects, one of the things we could do is look at the growth formula. So we could substitute the investment rate for the definition of growth, which is that growth is equal to the investment rate times the return on that investment. That would let us see whether we were taking on projects that had a lower return than what we need or what we expect. And if we're doing that, then we would assume that the manager was behaving in a manner that is not conducive to creating value. So again, we stick with our main formula, but a couple of substitutions brings us to something called the key value driver formula, which is what we have here. The key value driver formula says that value is equal to operating profit, NOPLAT, times 1 minus the investment rate, which is growth divided by the return on invested capital. All of that divided by the discount rate, WACC, minus the growth rate. Okay? So this is the standard model for value. This is the model for value that most firms and advisories are going to use. And this is the model for value that we are going to use going forward. Sometimes we'll just call it the KVD formula. But this is the model that determines the value of any firm and investment. And it seems really straightforward, and it is actually. We just have to be careful with how we think about it and how we interpret it. Okay. So again, let's try to look at this model and think about it more critically. Right? So there are now 4 components: starting operating profit, NOPLAT, the growth rate in cash flows, G, the return on invested capital, ROIC, and WACC, the discount rate, the risk of the firm. So again, we can just go through and think about how these things should affect value and see if that's how it works within the model. So we see that an increase in operating profit ideally should increase value. And indeed, if we look at the model, if NOPLAT goes up, the numerator gets larger and value increases. We can do the same thing for return. If return increases, we should expect that to be an increase in value. If a company is investing and earning more money on each investment, again, we should assume that that is a value-creating proposition. And indeed, if we see that ROIC, and this is a little bit harder to see, so it might help you to notice this if you plug some numbers in, but if the return on invested capital goes up, right, the G divided by ROIC gets smaller. That means 1 minus that figure gets larger, and that means the remainder of the numerator stays large, and that means value increases. So as return goes up, value goes up. Again, that's what we hope and expect this model to show. Now, as WACC goes up, we have the same interpretation and the same result as previously. As the risk of the firm goes up, the cash flows get riskier, and indeed we should expect value to decrease, and that's exactly what we see in this model. If WACC gets higher, the denominator gets larger and value decreases. Finally though, we look at growth and we say, if growth goes up, we should expect value to go up. Because if growth rises based on good fundamentals, then cash flows get larger and the firm gets more valuable. But actually, it's not clear anymore in this model because of the substitutions, and because G is both in the numerator and the denominator, it's not clear actually what the impact of growth is. And that is because of our substitutions. This is how we're going to make sure that we are keeping the managers honest. And it's actually the fact that growth will increase value in some situations and decrease value in others. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So one of the things that we need to, again, be conscious of, and I talked about this quite a bit in the last lecture, but I want to touch on it some more, is that the valuation here, the model, is the last step in our process. And determining all the values, all the inputs to this model is significantly more time consuming and difficult than doing the calculation, because this is just simple algebra here. Right? And so the result that comes out, the number, the specific number of value, is not that important. It's not as important per se as the way and the thought that we put into determining the inputs. The real benefit to this model is it gives us an ability to very concretely talk about value and talk about the inputs and those inputs' effect on value. Right? So it gives us a way to, it gives us a framework to discuss value in a very specific way. So it allows us to move away from being very vague about things or decisions that a firm might make. So a firm might say, we want to introduce a new product, and we think that the product is going to increase profit and it's going to generate all this revenue, and that's bound to increase value. And what a model like this does is it gives us a framework to talk about that specifically. We can say, okay, here are the 4 inputs to value. Which one of these inputs is actually going to be increased by this new product? Are you thinking that it's going to increase the growth rate in cash flows? Do you think that it's going to raise your operating profit? Is this new product going to raise the overall return on invested capital for the firm? Is it possible that this new product decreases the risk of your cash flows? Right? Because we have made this very specific and very concrete formula, despite all its problems, and we can't avoid that it still has problems, but despite all its problems, it gives us a concrete way to talk about value. And so each decision that a manager makes, and whether we're inside the firm or outside the firm, as we're trying to judge those decisions throughout our evaluation process, we are going to be able to judge each of those decisions in a really specific, straightforward way. If the decision that the firm makes doesn't increase one of these characteristics in a way that also increases value, it's not a project that we want to take on. Right? It's a project that maybe is going to decrease value, it's maybe going to leave value flat. What we have to do is try to determine which of these value drivers, right, is actually going to create value, or how the project is going to affect which of these value drivers and how that's going to create value.